Welcome to Bada Boom. I'm Chris. On this episode, we have on Thomas Huls, founder of World at War Comics. Huls, who has created a comics focused podcast, has interviewed everyone from Tod McFarlane to Goeff Johns, using that knowledge to launch his own comic, Kingsville. Now on issue 2, Tommy talks about the challenges of launching your own comic and how much that has informed his podcast. Listen in and bada boom. Hey Tommy, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me, man. Big fan of the show, and I'm glad to be here.
Appreciate it. I'm glad to have you on. Also a fan of your show at World at War Comics. Also, you have a Kickstarter for your comic Kingsville, which we're now on issue 2. So tell me a little bit about how that started.
Yeah, I mean, the Kickstarter ended. We were successful, which was awesome. So we finally got it printed, and everybody's Kickstarter has been fulfilled up to this point. At least I hope so. No one said anything yet. But yeah, I mean, it was awesome. When you're trying to create something and you have anybody that's interested in following you, it's always an honor. And every issue we get more and more people following and more people interested. And actually tomorrow I have a signing at a comic shop. I had one about 2 weeks ago. So I feel like you're kind of getting into a groove. People are starting to understand the story and all that good stuff. Whenever someone comes out with a Kickstarter with one issue, I think people are kind of like, let's see if they go more than one
Yeah.
issue before I get totally invested. So I think by the time you get to your second, third issue, people are like, okay, they're going to be here for a little while.
Yeah, and I think it's always tough because a lot of times with Kickstarters, you tend to follow the people you trust in just because Kickstarter is a platform where, even if you invest in someone you trust in, there's a possibility that Kickstarter cannot be fulfilled. So what it's been like to sort of be in a position where, you're seeing returning readers, you're seeing people that you may recognize at signings and stuff. What's that been like?
It's awesome. Anytime that you create anything, right, you're putting yourself out there for good and for bad, right? And there's always going to be someone who doesn't like what you do, and there's going to be some people who do like what you do. And I'm always amazed when there's more people who like it than not, which is pretty cool. But it's very satisfying. I had this idea for a comic story. I put it down on paper, got an artist, and so far so good. So yeah, it feels good, man. I enjoy it. I'm a comic book fan, have been since I was about 8 or 9 years old. And finally, I'm at an age where all my kids are older, and this is definitely a hobby, an expensive one. My
Yeah.
wife is constantly telling me, but yeah, so far so good, man. It's been a great experience. Going to Comic Cons and doing signings there, and yeah, just getting the word out.
Yeah. And you talk about being a fan, and obviously we see your background. You have all mainly like DC toys and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But what was sort of the moment sort of that you said, you wanted to be a creator? I think that's a huge leap. Like we all sort of love comics and we all talk like we're writers when we're complaining about certain storylines and stuff like that. It's like, oh, I wish they would do this and that. So was there a particular moment you remember where that, you had that, realization that you're like, hey, like, I finally want to put this out there. I don't know if people are going to read this, but I feel like I want to make a comic book. I'm passionate about it.
Yeah. Well, I think all of us, especially if you've been reading comics since you're very small, um, you probably sat down on the floor with the comic book open with a pad of paper. You're either tracing your favorite characters or trying to redraw them. And then it kind of moves into, I want to create my own character. And it ends up being a corny kind of knockoff of Superman or the
Yeah.
Flash or Wolverine or something like that, whatever's popular at the time. And then you kind of just throw it in the back of your heart, right? And you kind of
Yeah.
bury it, and you just go about your business about being a comic book fan. But then, I got into business. I went to college, got my master's degree. Been in the grocery industry for 30 years now. And I was writing articles for Forbes magazine on different topics pertaining to leadership, which I loved. I've written several articles for Forbes, but even though that was kind of fun, my heart has always been in comic books, and I've had this story in the back of my mind for a very long time. And during the pandemic, I think a lot of people were like, maybe I should start writing some of this stuff down.
Mhm.
You can only work so much in front of your computer. You might as well do something else. And so I started writing down a story. And then about a year and a half ago, I had a kidney transplant, and I was out of work for about 6 months, just bored out of my mind. And my wife said, look, you're driving me crazy. You've been wanting to do this for a while. Why don't you just do it? Now's the
Mhm.
time. And that's what I did. So last year we launched our first Kickstarter. We had a successful Kickstarter with issue number one. Then all of a sudden you go back to work and things kind of slowed down.
Yeah.
But then, issue two was done actually at the end of last year, but we didn't. And we had our Kickstarter in December, which is a terrible time to do a Kickstarter, by the way. But I went ahead
I'll
and
keep
did
that
it.
noted.
Yeah, oh, it's terrible. Yeah, I just, people are saving up for holiday gifts and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And they just, I think it's one of the less trafficked time for Kickstarter. But that was successful, and now we're about almost halfway through issue three. And so, yeah, I mean, my wife encouraged me to do it. I think she regrets it now because it's an expensive hobby. But yeah, I've always had this desire to do it. I had a story for about 5 years, and last year we made it happen. So very satisfying, to be honest.
Yeah. And you talk about the expense, and I think that's something that like doing the podcast, you learn sort of talking to different creators, especially creator owned creators. Like sometimes you're like, oh, like even sort of the image sort of dream that people have, that's an expense, in terms of like the way that structure is. People think like, oh, they take your pitch, they pay
Yeah.
for it, you're great, you know what I mean? Like you don't have to do anything. But it is expensive, and sort of like also like, obviously you have a master's in business and stuff, but there are challenges in terms of logistics too, because you're dealing with a customer that is like, they're collectors, you know what I mean? They won't accept, hey, you ship a comic out, it comes with a ding, you're like, I have to eat that, you know what I mean? So what was that like, sort of like putting that together? Was it something that like surprised you when you sort of put it together? Because at first you're like, you're writing the story, you're like, this cost me nothing, and then you're like, all right, let me get an artist. It's like, well, they have a page rate, and then printing, and then shipping, and then obviously the time is spent marketing it. So what was that like, sort of like, was it something that surprised you when you were putting together?
It's certainly, yeah, I guess there was a little bit of surprise, being on the business side. I'm used to kind of, in sales, right? I'm in sales.
Yeah.
You're constantly putting yourself out there. You're constantly, you know, pounding the pavement, trying to find potential customers. And you got to be a little bit aggressive when you do that. And so I took the same approach with the comic book. When the wife and I sat down, she goes, just do this. You've always wanted to do it. I actually created an LLC. That was one of the
Mm,
first things that I did. I wanted to do this in a very legit way. I also wanted to protect myself because it is a very expensive and it's an investment. And creating an LLC is a good way to recuperate any kind of losses until your comic book starts to turn a profit.
yeah.
And most people that start a comic book especially through independent means on Kickstarter or Zoop or some of these other ones, Fund My Comic, Indiegogo. A lot of that cost comes out of your own pocket. Even if you have a successful Kickstarter, you're not the average comic book costs between $4,000 and $5,000 to produce. Most of that is page rates from artists, and then printing. And depending on where you print, it's anywhere from it could be $500 for 200 issues. It could be $1,000 depending on who you're printing from. So printing is extremely expensive as well. And I knew I wasn't going to recuperate that in my first Kickstarter because I'm an unknown commodity. And because of that, people have to take a chance. And there's just a lot of traffic on Kickstarter.
Mm,
I consider that my second LCS, to be honest.
mm,
So I go to my LCS, I pick up my Wednesday comics, and then I go on Kickstarter all the time just to see what else is out there that's kind of unique. And so because of that, I took a business approach. So obviously scary. Anytime you take a chance on anything, you're a little
mm,
nervous. But I also protected myself by ensuring from a tax perspective, I would have write-offs for anything that I wasn't able to recoup in the production of the comic book, which allows me then to, the next year to ensure that I'm able to continue it. Whereas if I didn't do that, right, I'd have some losses.
yeah. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's something obviously like that doesn't get shared too much, sort of like that behind the scenes aspect of it. And I think
Mhm.
that's why we kind of get in, and not just in comic books, but Kickstarters in general, where people sort of like fumble, like even if they have a really like interesting idea, people get behind them money wise. There's that like that overwhelming, like, wait, I wasn't meant to be a business person. Like now I have to do all these things. You're customer service, you're the CEO, you're, shipping and handling, all these kind of things. And I think it is always good to kind of share those things, because when you're sort of making that decision, I think you have to understand, like, hey, this is a big responsibility. I'm taking people's money
Mhm.
now. Like, before it was just my idea and stuff like that. Now it's like, hey, like, I have a responsibility to, those customers.
Absolutely.
But talking about like Kingsville, like we haven't really got into the story. Like reading issue one, it's a really big story. And for you, was it scary as well doing a Kickstarter where you sort of have one issue and then, like, let's say, you weren't able to do an issue two, you'd be like, wait, like I have this whole world of story to tell. What's that like sort of creating that? And was it something you felt like you had to scale down a bit just because of the the crowdfunding aspect of it? Or did you just say like, hey, let me make the best possible issue one, make it big, bombastic, and then, see what happens?
Yeah. I always had a four issue arc. That was always the agreement that I had when I sat down with my wife. I said, let me try this. It's a scratch or an itch that I have to scratch. I've always wanted to do this. I have a story that should be able to be told within four issues. That would be considered the arc will turn into a trade because that's a completely different customer usually is that
Yeah.
trade folks are different than floppy folks. And then at that point, if it's paying for itself, then I know I can continue. If not, then the itch has been scratched and I'm
Mhm.
still a big fan of comic books. Love independent comic books. I probably spend 60% of my money on independence, to be honest, just because I think the stories that are being told in independence right now are kind of leading the way because they don't have the handcuffs of 80 years of history with a certain character. So there's a lot of unique things they can do, which is a lot of fun. So yeah, it was always a four floppy story, and I'm halfway through issue three, and I already have four pretty much written. And once those are out, we'll see what happens. This last Kickstarter was pretty good. I have a feeling three will be even better, and we'll go from there.
Nice. And you're talking about sort of doing signings and stuff like that. What was it like sort of approaching shops to get into shops? Because I know sometimes, particularly with shops, it's also a trust thing. It's like, hey, like, will this person deliver issue two? Or, especially like if you get into previews, like, hey, if you have a delay, we're probably never gonna buy your book again. So it's a tough audience. So what was it like sort of approaching shop owners? Was it sort of your local shop, or were you reaching out to like other shops in the area to kind of see like what their interest would be?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, most shops don't want to deal with comic books through any kind of a crowdfunding, right?
Mm,
Most shops consider that competition.
mm,
They're not big fans of crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo. I reached out to over 300 shops around the United States, and out of the 300 shops that I reached out to for both issue one and issue two, probably five responded positively.
mm,
Another 10 or so said we don't deal with Kickstarters, and everyone else never responded.
mm,
And so, as I talk to other creators, it's really tough when you're crowdfunding because shops usually don't deal with that. The other thing too is, if you're a shop owner, you're already going through Diamond, you're going through Lunar, you're probably going through Penguin for some things.
mm.
You already have three different places you're buying comics from. To go to Kickstarter and start to go through people's stuff, it's just unpractical.
Yeah.
So I understand that part of it too. So the idea is that you crowdfund, you get a good story arc, and then you can shop it around to, larger publishers, with the hopes that, you get into Diamond and
Mm,
they help push the marketing and you can be more successful. So that's one route, or you finish the four-part arc and then you go through Diamond, but all issues are done.
mm,
And that makes it a lot easier from a preview standpoint where shops to be able to trust because everything's done. There's really nothing on my end that's going to stop that.
yeah.
Um, so there's a couple different routes you could go, and that's probably what we'll do once the fourth one is done. So I'm not really focusing on retailers
Yeah.
until I have, those four done. That way they feel more comfortable. But as far as going around, most shops, if you already have your comic done,
Mm,
you could walk in whether it was crowdfunded or not, as long as you have the comics in your hand. Most of them are really nice and will let you set up a table. It draws a little bit maybe more business for them. It also they like to support, the independent side of the business. They just necessarily don't want to shop for the independent comics off of Kickstarter.
yeah, that makes sense. And I think it goes back to that trust stuff, just because
Yeah.
I think especially when it comes to the direct market, there's a lot of trust. There's, you know, pull list. They order comics before people actually buy them. You're ordering on sometimes the strength of a name, like hoping this will sell. Sometimes there isn't like a direct like numbers thing. You're kind of going with your gut. I mean, hopefully people are kind of shifting that thinking, especially with the way the market shifted with comics. But it is great to see sort of like the independent, you know, scene. I've been seeing a lot more like Kickstarter show up in the shop. You know what I mean? Like even in a big retailer, like you know, here we have Midtown Comics. Like sometimes you'll see some of those books show up there. Obviously, most of those have come from like publishers,
Mhm.
you know, like Massive or Clover's another one that supports Kickstarter comics and stuff like that, or AWA does stuff like that too.
Yeah.
But it is cool to kind of see that scene supported, just because the more you talk, and I'm sure you've done this too, sort of like you talk to retailers or the publishers, you find that hey, like the big two is kind of hey, that game is really just like variants at this point. What
Yeah.
people are actually reading and showing up to the shop for to like read is those independent books, just because that's where the new stories are. That's where the new characters are, you know? So it is great to kind of see more people dive into it, because I think for so long we're so all dependent on those big two comics like Spider-Man, Batman. We all love them. Like, listen, you know, if you look behind both of us, those characters are there. But I think
Absolutely.
just because of the natures of that business, where you have them both being owned by billion dollar corporations, where honestly comics don't move the needle, so it's not something they pay attention to too much. So it seems like, you know, they don't big moves are not happening in terms of the direction of those things. You see a lot of cool stuff happening in the independents. Obviously, like we have like Boom, Image, but also Kickstarter comics are really fun. And I think I've gotten doing the podcast gotten more into being like, you know what, let me shop Kickstarter. Let me see, you know, what are the picks of the week and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many good stories being told. I just had two guys on from, well, one lives in San Diego, Arthur, and then his artist lives in San Jose. And they have a comic book called California Inc. And I had them on the podcast yesterday. In fact, I think it's posted now, but I had a blast talking to them, and they have such a unique storyline. Like, what if California succeeded from the Union,
Mhm.
and became their own corporation, and then the infighting on how that country would be run, and then all the issues that causes when they separate themselves from the rest of the United States, like water sources, which
Yeah.
come from like, the Colorado Rockies, and like all these little
Mhm.
kind of political things happening behind the scenes, the backstabbing. It's an amazing comic book, and I would have never known about it unless I was on Kickstarter kind of messing around. So there's so many. I could go through a list of comic books that I have read off of Kickstarter that are just absolutely amazing. We got Concrete Comics, Godhood Comics,
Mm.
Dream Fury, which is in your backyard
Yeah.
with new all of those. Probably one of the best independent comics I've ever read comes from him, and the art from um, Giancarlo. He's from the Philippines. One of the best artists you'll ever see. And he does everything in kind of a grayscale with red tones for blood because it is kind of a vampire, comic book. But there's just, I could go on and on. I'm just so amazed by the comic creations that have been done. Yeah, I love it, man. Absolutely love it.
And with your show, like, was there a piece of advice that a creator gave you when you sort of got on this journey that really stuck with you?
I mean, the whole purpose of the podcast was to learn the craft, right?
Mm.
You get into comic books, it's different. It just is different, right? And there's a lot of moving pieces from finding an artist, which, a lot of independent creators, myself included, have been burned on because you're dealing with people from other countries. Maybe they don't speak English very well. So there's a lot of back and forth. You got to be careful not to send money until you know that you have a
Yeah.
really partner. Like there's all kinds of scary stuff going on. And then just writing, because I've been more on the business side of things, trying not to be too dry in my writing
The
is something that I can learn too, right? Because it's not just, busting out facts and pie charts of how business is and you know
Mhm.
what I mean? So
Yeah.
there's got to be some emotion to it. And I said, well, why don't I interview some people? And through that, I can learn the craft. And that's how it started. and I reached out to actually Tony Cottrell, who is in Baltimore. He owns Advent Comics, was my first interview I ever had on my podcast. And just a genuinely amazing person. He's a firefighter, getting close to retirement age, but he's owned Advent for 15 years and has all kinds of comics. And now he's branched out, and so many people are publishing under Advent now. It's incredible. But he helped me out a lot. So just reaching out to these folks, learning the craft through my interview. So
Yeah.
selfishly, it was really for me to learn, but at the same time to highlight independent comic books. And then when I started to get, folks from I would say the big three to come on the podcast,
Yeah.
it just brought even more eyes onto those independent creators. If you came in for a Tod McFarlane or a Goeff Johns, hopefully you're going through all the
Yeah.
other interviews. You're like, well, maybe I'll, Pornsack and
Yeah.
Jesse Lonergan, and maybe I could, check out these guys too, and hopefully it helps them as well. So then it became about how do I support indie comics the best? And that's really just to keep bringing more eyes on all these creators that are doing amazing stuff.
It's awesome. And what was it like, sort of, being in a position where you started it very small and now you're at the point where you're interviewing people like Todd and Jeff? I could look behind you and see sort of a lot of McFarlane toys. I love your Instagram where you're sort of showing off, your unboxings and stuff. And obviously you have a whole Green Lantern set. So what was it like sort of to get to that point? And, I think doing this as well has also been sort of like really surreal, and being able to have opportunities like that. I've gotten to speak with Jeff, and that was
Yeah.
like amazing. I got to tell him like, hey, like my first summer job, I was buying Blackest Night that summer.
Yeah.
Not to make you feel old or anything,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
so it is cool to kind of be in that position, because I'm sure you've been there where you've read books and you're like, oh my God, like a genius created. How did they think of this world and stuff? So
Yeah.
what's it been like sort of to be in that position and also be a platform? I think somewhere where people are like, hey, like I know if I do Tommy's show, people are gonna listen to it, they're gonna love it. I know he's really passionate. So what's it been like to sort of be in that position?
I mean, it's awesome. Like you,
Mm.
I mean, I'm probably much older than you. I'm close to 50 now, but Goeff Johns is probably my favorite comic book writer. His what he did at DC, I don't know will ever be replicated in that kind of a level. I mean, his 10-year run on Green Lantern, huge. And I'm a huge Green Lantern fan. It's my favorite part of the DC universe. I am a DC guy. Doesn't mean I don't like Marvel, though. I love X-Men. I love Spider-Man. I love all these other. In fact, what you can't see is my shelf here with all my Marvel Legends and my Marvel Select over here. So I collect a little bit of everything, but yeah, I mean, it's nerve-wracking when you're talking to someone because you know them and they have
Yeah.
no idea who you are, right? To a
Yeah.
certain extent, right?
Mhm.
And I know all of his writings. I'm looking at right now in front of me all his omnibus, The Blackest Night, Brightest
Yeah.
Day, his 2 volumes of his omnibus of just Green Lantern. I got Peter Tomasi with a Green Lantern Corpse. I mean,
Mhm.
to be able to talk to these guys was just
Yeah.
nerve-wracking, but also just so satisfying because when you look at comic book writing, some of these folks are top of the game. From an independent side, you see what Todd and Liefeld and Silvestri and I mean, what they did in the 90s really took independent from some kind of obscure, kind of odd little thing that's happening in comic books and brought it to the forefront. And because of that, they kind of laid the foundation, even though I think they created a boom and then they created a bust, right? Because people are waiting in hour lines to get, whatever Spawn or whatever.
Easy
Um,
E too, Easy
oh
E was
yeah,
on those lines, so
100%. Yeah.
that
And
was a
so,
cultural moment.
oh, it's huge. I mean, yeah, Easy E is in line in Compton,
Mhm.
at a local comic book shop waiting for Liefeld to sign, and you see videos and pictures of them together. I mean, that is just nuts, right? That's crazy. So they created this phenomenon that eventually there was a bust, but then it came back. But they laid the foundation for so many people to jump into independent comics. And what you realize is DC and Marvel aren't the only ways into this industry. Now there's so many different ways. I mean, you look at Dark Horse, and I had Mark London on, and they're celebrating their 10th anniversary of Mad Cave. It's just incredible, all these other publishers that have come, and now they're doing great things, and they've opened doors for a lot of creators to enter into the industry that I'm not sure they would have had the same time. trying to enter in if it was only Marvel and DC. So yeah, I mean it's exciting time to be in comics right now. I think there's certainly some issues happening in comics, but I think a lot of those issues are, it's hard to track what's happening in crowdfunding. So we know the numbers of sales on Marvel and DC have declined, and that's why the variant side of the business have become a really big part of it for collectors because that's how they're making up for producing less issues. But it's a lot has to do with crowdfunding. I mean, go to Kickstarter now. There's probably 600 different comic books that are on Kickstarter, right? And that's just one platform, Indiegogo and Fund My Comic. So they have a lot more competition than they ever had before. And a lot of the creators that we grew up loving have now moved on to do their own thing. I know you've had a lot of folks from Ghost Machine like I have
Yeah.
on, which I'm so excited. It's like a Hall of Fame. Like if you went to the NBA Hall of Fame and you just started grabbing folks, like here's Jordan
Yeah.
and here's like it's incredible. Magic Johnson and here's Kobe, and I'm gonna just make a comic book company out of these folks. I mean, that's what I feel like Ghost Machine has done with Peter Tomasi, Brian Hitch, Jason Fabok. I mean, it's incredible. Obviously,
Ivan
Jeff Johns.
Reese, as a Green Lantern fan.
Man, it's incredible, right?
Yeah.
It's insane what they put together. So they're creating a lot of excitement, I think, for comics, which needs it right now, and I'm all in for it, man.
Yeah, yeah, and I think sort of that what Image did was not just that company. I think it created like a real like independent spirit in comics, which
Yes.
sort of it trickles down to people like you, like how you get to a Kickstarter and stuff like that. Just because I think there was a mindset like, hey, like you need a publisher. But now it's sort of like the platforms that are available, you're able to connect with people in a different way, and people are able to connect with you in a much more different way than they were some creators. Like you with your show, like a lot of people might know you a little bit more intimately than they know some creators, so they might see your stuff on Kickstarter and be like, hey, like I'm just gonna support Tommy just because I know he knows comics, I know he's passionate about it. So it is good to kind of see like that be there's so many ways people could get in. There's almost like no excuse to not do it.
Yeah, for sure. I had Larry Stroman on, and him and Todd created a comic book called Tribe, in the 90s with Image. So right when Image started, they came out and I think they had two or three issues before they separated from Image. And I don't know all the reasons why, but I'm sure it had to do with maybe, you know, maybe not having their comic ready on time. Like who, I don't know
Yeah.
all the reasons, right? And you read about it, and I don't like to get into that, man. It's not
Yeah,
my
yeah,
business.
yeah, of course.
But I had Larry on and I made a comment. I said, yeah, it's easier today than ever before. And he corrected me, goes, it's not easy. And it's not. He's absolutely right.
Yeah,
Reading a comic book is not easy. It's simpler, but it's not easy. So you
yeah,
have Comic Wellspring, you have Kablam, you have Print Ninja. There's so many different places where you could get your own creation printed. So you don't really need a publisher to do that. You could go to Reddit and find a really good artist,
yeah,
or you could Facebook. There's all kinds of comic book art platforms. You still got to be careful,
yeah.
but it's easier today than ever before to be partnered with someone to if you need an artist or if you need a writer or a letterer. It's incredible. So yeah, now it is easier today than ever before to create your own comic book. So
Mhm,
yeah, there as long as you could afford it, there's really no reason not to try it,
mhm.
if that's your passion. But 20 years ago is not going to happen, right? It's much more difficult.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about stuff like Webtoon, you know what I mean? You could just publish it on there and there's so many eyes on there and stuff like that. I always kind of I'm always fascinated just by because people say sort of like kids aren't into comic books, but it's like, hey, like, manga is like sequential storytelling, so it's the same thing. It's just like, hey, like that's where the energy is right now. Like but it is fascinating to kind of see that kind of stuff. But you could tell like kids are still passionate about like, like, hey, these are kind of like superhero stories. So you could see that they're still into it. It's just like, hey, like, Spider-Man might not be their thing. Or, and also too, I think there's also sort of one thing about comics that I think sort of is to their detriment is that, comics have to compete with their themselves. Like, hey, there's a Spider-Man in movies, there's a Spider-Man in games. So it's like if a kid doesn't really like what's going on in the comics, they're like, well, I like the game. Like my son, he loves Spidey and His Amazing Friends, and he
Yeah.
also likes the Spider-Man 2 PS5 game. And it's like he'll probably never pick up a Spider-Man comic in his life, and he'll be all right. He would have had the whole like Doctor Octopus story and all these things. So it is cool to kind of see like what is available out there because there's just so much. Like sometimes I get overwhelmed. I'm like, hey, like I love supporting like American and Western comics, and then I try like some manga to be like, all right, let me try to stay young and stuff like that. What are these kids reading now? But it is great. There's so much stuff out there, and I'm really happy that you put yourself out there because it's not easy. You know what I mean? Like as you even having a podcast, I'm sure you're like sometimes you get comments and stuff like that. You're like, why do I
Oh,
do this? It's like why am I putting myself out there? I have a job. Like why am I doing this? But it is always good to see people pursue their dreams even in that small little piece because it does take a lot, in terms of like capital and then also sort of courage, to put yourself out there and be like, hey, like what if people think this idea is dumb and stuff like that. So I'm glad that, you got it printed right behind you. You're sort of pushing ahead and, hopefully you get to that point where you have that trade and, you're signing at Barnes and Noble versus LCS.
yeah, I mean, that would be the goal. I mean, as long as, people read it and they enjoy it, then I'll be able to continue. If they don't, that's okay.
Yeah.
Like I said, it was an itch that I scratched. I'm at an age in my life where I could do it because all my kids are all adults now. So the timing's right for me. And yeah, it's been fun so far. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah. And like what's coming up? So like now you just fulfilled issue 2. You've talked about sort of issue 3 sort of being in development. Like what's that timeline look like? When can Kingsville fans expect issue 3?
Yeah, the idea is at the end of May we'll have our Kickstarter. I like to have the comic book just about done before I do the Kickstarter. That way I can fulfill as soon as possible. So like within a month after the Kickstarter, I'd like everyone to have their book. I know you don't have to do that. I have friends that they don't start their comic book unless they fund, which is great too,
Yeah.
as long as the people that are backing you understand that. But we're competing against an LCS, whereas if I want the new red coat from Ghost Machine,
Yeah.
walk into my store and I pick it up, right? So if I'm on Kickstarter, if I could be as close to getting that in their hands as possible from the point of purchase, I think that's good, right? And when the Kickstarter ends, they charge you. I'd like to have that book in their hands within a couple weeks, if possible. So I'm gonna try and get it almost done before we do the Kickstarter, and then I'm just re-putting those funds back into the account to recuperate from the prior one, and then those funds help fund issue 4. So that's kind of the idea right now, and so far it's worked for me. And I've been able to fulfill fairly quickly. This last time there was an issue with the printer where I
Yeah.
had 3 different variants and they put the
Yeah.
same on all 3 variants, and there's an right
Yeah.
SKU on the back. So I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work. So just trying to get that done. Kind of delayed it by about a week and a half, almost 2 weeks actually. But yeah, that's what happens, right? So you just have to be
Yeah.
over creative and make sure people understand that they're going to get what they invested in for sure.
Yeah, yeah. From what I hear, don't do foil variants. Those are the ones that are really tough to print, and those could really create a headache.
They're a headache. They're expensive. Highly collectible. I understand why people like them. I have a couple in my collection, but I really don't. I'm not a big variant guy. It
Yeah.
kind of irritates me to too many variants. I could see one or two, but when you got, I think when Dynamite came out with some of their Disney villains,
Thundercats.
yeah,
Two
it was like
Thundercats was
20 something. And so I'm like, who's collecting that?
yeah.
That's a $100 investment just for issue 1, man. 100 for 22 pages. It's like,
Yeah.
well,
No,
hey,
it was
that's your thing, man. Like, no hate at all.
yeah.
That's whatever, but that's crazy, man.
I mean, someone's buying it. Someone's buying it. I
I
went
can't
to
do that, man. Like, I
yeah.
understand 2 or 3 variants is kind of cool, especially if you get some really unique artists. But man, when you're doing that, that's nuts. That's crazy, man. But hey,
Hey,
oh,
like I said, they're buying. When I bought Thundercats 1, they have at the back kind of like the checker box. I was like, what the fuck? I was so confused. I was like, because the shot, like I'm at Midtown, so Midtown has like a lot of them. I'm like, they only have like 4 on the shelf. So I'm like, where do you even buy all these variants?
yeah,
But yeah,
not,
I think
not
yeah,
many. Always try to stop by a Midtown. It's awesome.
Yeah, it is cool, but it's one of those things where I think that's just like where the comic book industry is when with some of those bigger characters and stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you've been able to do that. Like I said, we've talked about it. Sort of trust is really important, and sort of having that commitment to the backers and the customers is really important. And I think that's what's going to bring people back because, again, so many people get burned even from big stuff. You know what I mean? So but yes, Tommy, thank you for coming on. It's been a great conversation. Good luck with issue 3 and with the trade. I can't wait to get a physical copy, hopefully signed. But thanks for coming on. Definitely check out Tommy at World at War Comics. Tell people where to find you.
Yeah, I mean, you can find me everywhere. It's World at War Comics on every platform you could think of from a social media standpoint. It's World at War Comics on YouTube. You could go to worldatwarcomics.com. You could purchase issues 1 and 2 there with all the variants. You could go to our TikTok shop. That seems to be the most popular place to purchase it. And then I have an eBay store too. So if you just search Kingsville, it'll pop up and you can buy it from there. Same price everywhere. But yeah, really appreciate it, Chris, coming on. Big fan of your show.
Okay.
Congratulations on the success. And yeah, awesome, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. And with that, bada boom.
Bada boom.